The camera was already rolling when Barbara Walters leaned forward in her chair, clicked her pen twice, and smiled. It was the kind of smile that had made senators sweat, that had made movie stars cry on national television, that had unraveled carefully constructed public personas in front of millions of viewers. Barbara Walters was the most powerful interviewer in America, and she had been preparing for this moment for 3 years. Across the coffee table, Whitney Houston smoothed the front of her burgundy blazer, crossed her legs, and looked back. She did not flinch. She did not look away. What happened in that studio over the next 47 minutes would become one of the most talked about interviews in television history. Not because Barbara won, but because of what Whitney did when Barbara pushed too hard. If you have ever loved Whitney Houston's voice, stay right here. Subscribe and hit the bell, because this channel tells the stories that never made the headlines. It was the fall of 1993, and Whitney Houston was, by any measurable standard, the most famous woman on the planet. The Bodyguard soundtrack had sold over 40 million copies worldwide. I Will Always Love You had spent 14 consecutive weeks at #1, shattering records that had stood for decades. She had won every award the industry had to offer. She had performed before kings, presidents, in packed stadiums from Tokyo to London to Johannesburg. The world had decided that Whitney Houston was perfect, and that was exactly the problem. Because behind every perfect image, there is a human being carrying a weight that the cameras never quite capture. Behind the sequined gowns and the flawless vocal runs and the blinding smile, there was a woman who had been told, from the time she was a teenager singing in the choir at New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey, exactly who she needed to be, exactly how she needed to sound, exactly what kind of product she needed to become. Whitney Houston had been shaped, polished, and packaged by some of the most powerful people in the music industry. And in 1993, some of those people thought she was finally starting to crack. Barbara Walters knew this. That was why she had fought so hard to get this interview. To understand what happened in that studio, you have to go back to Newark. You have to go back to a little girl standing beside her mother, Cissy Houston, one of the most respected gospel vocalists in American music. Cissy did not raise Whitney to be a pop star. She raised her to be a vessel. She raised her to understand that the voice was not a commodity. It was a calling. Every Sunday morning, little Whitney watched her mother open her mouth and fill a church with something that had no business fitting inside a human throat. The congregation would close their eyes. Grown men would weep. Women would reach up toward the ceiling with their hands, as if the sound itself were something they could hold on to. "Baby," Cissy would tell her daughter after service, "that sound you just heard? That came from somewhere deeper than talent. That came from truth." Whitney never forgot those words, but the music industry had a different set of instructions. When Clive Davis signed Whitney Houston to Arista Records in 1983, he saw something once in a generation. The voice was obvious. Anyone with ears could hear that. But what Clive Davis spent the next decade building around that voice was a brand. Whitney would be the crossover artist, the bridge between black music and white radio, the pop princess who could bring gospel fire to the mainstream without making the mainstream uncomfortable. Elegant, poised, precise. Everything that America wanted a black female superstar to be in the 1980s. Exceptional enough to celebrate, but palatable enough not to threaten. The formula worked. It worked so spectacularly that it almost became a trap. By the early 1990s, certain critics, and uncertain voices within the black music community, had begun questioning whether Whitney Houston had strayed too far from her roots. They called her music sanitized. They questioned whether she had traded her gospel soul for commercial polish. At the 1989 Soul Train Music Awards, the crowd had booed her. Booed Whitney Houston, a moment so painful, so unexpected, so public that people who were in that room said she did not speak for the rest of the evening. She sat in the back of her car on the way to the hotel and stared out the window and said absolutely nothing. But even that wound, as deep as it went, was nothing compared to what was waiting for her in Barbara Walters' studio. And here is where the story takes a turn that nobody inside that building could have predicted. Barbara had done her research. She always did. Her team had compiled a dossier that included the rumors beginning to circulate in the tabloid press. Whispers about Whitney's personal life, about her marriage to Bobby Brown, about the private struggles the cameras had never been allowed to see. Barbara had built her career on asking the questions that publicists tried to prevent. She believed the public deserved the truth, and she had an almost surgical ability to find the precise spot where a subject's composure was thinnest and press there, gently but relentlessly, until something gave way. The interview began smoothly. Whitney answered the early questions with practiced warmth. She talked about the bodyguard. She talked about Bobby Christina, her daughter, and the light in her eyes when she mentioned her child was real and unscripted and beautiful. The crew behind the cameras relaxed slightly. This was going to be fine, they thought. But Barbara Walters had not built a 40-year career on straightforward. She shifted in her chair. She looked down at her notes for a moment, a technique she used deliberately, letting the silence expand just long enough to create discomfort. And then she looked back up at Whitney with that particular expression her subjects had learned to dread. It was not unkind. It was precise. It was the expression of someone who was about to say out loud the thing that everyone in the room had agreed, implicitly, not to say. "Whitney," Barbara said, her voice dropping just slightly, becoming almost gentle. "There are people who say that you have lost something, that the girl who sang in that Newark church, that raw, unfiltered gospel Whitney, is not the woman sitting across from me today, that the industry changed you in ways that can't be undone. What do you say to those people?" The room went quiet, not the polite quiet of a pause between questions. The specific electric quiet that happens when something true and sharp enters the air and every person in the room feels it at the same time. The camera operator held perfectly still. The floor producer stopped writing in his notepad. Even Barbara, who had asked thousands of questions over 4 decades, seemed to sense that this one had landed differently. Whitney Houston looked at Barbara Walters for a long moment. Her hands, which had been resting loosely in her lap, tightened slightly. Just slightly. Anyone who wasn't watching carefully would have missed it. But the camera caught it. 7 seconds passed. In television, 7 seconds of silence is an eternity. Long enough for a director in the control booth to start sweating. Long enough for a publicist to reach for her phone. Long enough for an audience, watching at home months later, to lean forward without quite knowing why. Whitney did not answer the question. Not with words. What happened next was not planned. It was not staged. Every person in that studio, people who had worked in television for decades, who thought they were professionally immune to surprise, would describe it the same way afterward. They would search for the right word and come back, again and again, to the same one. Whitney closed her eyes. Just for a moment. Just long enough to find something. And then she began to sing, not loudly, not with the full stadium-filling power that had made her famous. She sang quietly, almost to herself, the opening bars of "Bridge Over Troubled Water," a song that her mother had sung in churches across New Jersey before Whitney was born, a song that had nothing to do with the Bodyguard or Arista Records or crossover demographics or any of the machinery that had built and polished the brand known as Whitney Houston. She sang it the way Cissy had taught her, not for an audience, not for a camera, for something else entirely. The sound that came out of her in that moment was unlike anything anyone in that studio had heard before. And these were people who had heard her sing 100 times on television and radio. It was smaller than her famous voice. It was quieter. It was rougher around the edges in a way that her records never were. And it was so nakedly human, so completely stripped of performance that 2 of the cameramen later admitted they had to blink hard to keep their eyes from filling up. Barbara Walters did not move. She sat completely still, pen resting on her notepad, eyes fixed on the woman across from her. And something moved across Barbara's face that the cameras caught and that editors later argued about for hours. It was not the expression of a journalist who had just gotten the moment she came for. It was something more private, something Barbara Walters, in 40 years of interviews, did not show very often. She was moved, genuinely, unexpectedly, completely moved. Whitney sang for perhaps 30 seconds, maybe less. Then she opened her eyes, looked directly at Barbara, and said very quietly, "She's still here. She never went anywhere. She just had to wait." The rest of the interview was different after that. Barbara did not push again. She asked her remaining questions carefully, respectfully, with a quality in her voice that her regular viewers would have had trouble identifying because they so rarely heard it from her. She was gentle. She was listening. She was, for once, not the most powerful presence in the room. After the cameras stopped rolling and the crew began breaking down the equipment, Barbara Walters sat for a moment without getting up. Her producer came to her side and asked if she was ready to leave. Barbara looked up at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before in 15 years of working together. "That," she said quietly, "was the greatest interview I have ever done, and also the worst." He asked her what she meant. "The greatest," and she said, "because I was in the presence of something real. The worst because I almost broke it before it happened." She told a colleague privately that Whitney Houston was the only subject in her career who had made her feel, during the interview itself, that she was the one being interviewed. The footage from that session aired in November of 1993 and drew one of the largest audiences of any Barbara Walters special that decade. But what viewers remembered, what people talked about for months, what music journalists would reference for years, was not the famous questions or the carefully prepared answers. It was those 30 seconds. That quiet, unscripted moment when Whitney Houston closed her eyes and stopped being a brand and became simply and completely a voice. Whitney Houston carried that voice through every storm that followed, through the tabloid years and the difficult years and the years when the industry seemed to be looking away. The voice was always there, sometimes rougher, sometimes quieter, sometimes fighting through circumstances the church in Newark could never have prepared her for, but always, underneath everything, recognizably hers, recognizably real. Cissy Houston watched that Barbara Walters interview at home in New Jersey. When the 30 seconds happened, she put her hand over her mouth. After the special ended, she picked up the phone and called her daughter. "Baby," she said when Whitney answered. "I know, Mama," Whitney said. That was all. That was enough. Barbara Walters retired in 2014 after more than 50 years in broadcasting. She gave hundreds of interviews. Presidents, dictators, movie stars, criminals, saints. She was asked many times which interview she remembered most. She never gave quite the same answer twice. But people who knew her well said that whenever the subject came up, a particular expression would cross her face. Something very close to humility. The voice that silenced Barbara Walters was not the one on the records. It was not the one on the stadium stage or the movie soundtrack or the television special. It was the one that had learned itself in a church in Newark, New Jersey, beside a woman named Cissy, who understood that some sounds are not made. They are simply allowed to come through. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of everyone's expectations only to silence them with your true gift? Tell us your story in the comments below.